Thank you very much, and welcome you all to this session on investigations and imaging in uveitis. And I would like to welcome my co-chair, Professor Jyotirmay Biswas, and our moderators, Padma Malini and Anirudh, who will take up the moderation from now onwards. And it's indeed my pleasure and honor to invite Dr. Jyotirmay Biswas for another inspirational talk just after Professor Gupta's, but this one is related to research in uveitis. Over to you, Dr. Biswas.
Thank you, Dr. Bishali. My slides are visible?
Absolutely, sir. They're very clear, and your voice too.
Yeah. So I don't know my talk will inspire anybody or not.
Of course, it will inspire.
I will talk on research in uveitis, my journey and way forward. I'd like to thank Dr. Somushila and AIOS for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to share my humble experience. It was in 1985, I joined as a consultant finishing my vitreoretinal fellowship. I was given a research project, ocular morbidity in tuberculosis. Questions we asked that time, what is the ocular morbidity in active systemic tuberculosis? What are the various types of ocular tuberculosis seen? Is Eales disease seen in active systemic tuberculosis? I went to the Tuberculosis Research Center, made a makeshift ophthalmology clinic, and spent 1 year there seeing 1,500 patients of tuberculosis, active systemic tuberculosis. My finding, only 14 cases we found, and this is 1.39% was ocular morbidity. Most common was field focal choroiditis, and interestingly, no case of Eales disease was seen in this cohort. So this is the case of miliary tubercle of the choroid, which you have seen, and this photo was taken 36 years back. I was not sure about my findings because those days, the electronic literature search was not there. I did extensive manual search of the literature. I found my observation was correct. There was a TB sanatorium. They observed almost the similar findings. This was published in International Ophthalmology, Ocular Morbidity in Patients with Active Systemic Tuberculosis. Then I started looking for the TB in Path Lab registry, and there are only 5 cases where bugs are seen in 10-year period. 2 cases of subretinal abscess, 1 case of granulomatous uveitis with scleral perforation, 1 case of exudative mass in the anterior chamber, another case of choroidal mass with panuveitis. Only 5 cases in 10 years span, and we published in the Retina Journal. And this was one of the cases where we found subretinal abscess with retinal hemorrhage. The patient was put on antitubercular treatment and steroid. In spite of that, the patient went for panophthalmitis, and then we need to do the evisceration. Eviscerated tissues, we are surprised to see myriads of acid bacilli in the subretinal space. We used to see a lot of Eales disease patients. Now we don't see. That 1 in every 135 eye patients in the Shankar was Eales disease patient. So we asked the question, is the MTB there in the vitreous fluid? Many ophthalmologists, stalwart ophthalmologists used to think that the Eales disease is due to the TB. We want to have a definite proof of that. We got the vitreous fluid epiretinal membrane from the patient of Eales disease who are undergoing vitreoretinal surgery. We did smear culture and polymerase chain reaction. I worked with Professor Madhavan microbiology department for about 1 year, and we found that about 50% patients of the vitreous specimen was positive for Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA. However, culture was negative for MTB in all cases. This was published in British Journal of Ophthalmology. Subsequently, we looked in the epiretinal membrane for Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA, and we found 47% of the epiretinal membrane in Eales disease contains Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA. And this is the agar gel photograph showing positive Mycobacterium DNA amplification. We concluded the cell-mediated immunological reaction triggered by sequestered Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA or antigen plays important role in pathogenesis of Eales disease. We indeed found a Mycobacterium tuberculosis DNA with nested PCR in an enucleated eyeball of Eales disease patient. We compiled our data and gone through that 300 full text article and wrote a major review, which are often quoted in the literature in survey of ophthalmology. We didn't stop there. We looked into our outcome of large cohort of patients with Eales disease. We studied 500 patients, 898 eyes with 15.8 years mean follow-up, ranging from 10 to 25 years. We found bilaterality in 81% cases. And acute stage is the oral steroid, which provided better prognosis, laser treatment in the proliferative stage, and recurrence were not uncommon. 52% had less than 5 recurrence in 10 years period of time. We later on looked into the other aspect of the diseases, like other, which I wanted to mention, is the AIDS. Ocular lesions in AIDS, we were the first to report 2 cases of AIDS with ocular lesions. And subsequently, we studied 100 consecutive patients of AIDS, ocular HIV infections, lesions associated with HIV infection. And we went to an AIDS care center, and we found 40% patients had 1 or more ocular lesions that time. And this was published in American Journal of Ophthalmology. We looked in specifically ocular tuberculosis and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and we found 4.8% of the HIV patients has ocular tuberculosis. And it has got a protean manifestation starting from the small tubercle in the choroid to panophthalmitis. In the epidemiology of the uveitis, I had a humble beginning, and I used to give meticulous record of all uveitis cases by hand in register, writing it. I analyzed it when I had completed 1 year and wrote it up, published, and often cited in the literature, one of the first publication of pattern of uveitis in India. It was Dr. Devashish Das who compiled the data, and we found anterior uveitis is the most common, followed by the posterior uveitis, then intermediate uveitis, and pan uveitis. We studied the 23 years after, looked into the pattern of uveitis, what has changed occurred. We found the etiology was determined in more cases, like 66%, what is 41%. Intermediate uveitis was the second most common, unlike posterior uveitis in the previous series. Most common cause of posterior uveitis changed from toxoplasmosis to tuberculosis. It was a significant finding. We also found viral retinitis and increased from 0.76% to 6.8%. What I wanted to express that is that you need to follow your data and you can learn a lot. We had a chance to do while doing the grossing donor eye as a pathologist, I saw retinal hemorrhages in the eyeball of a patient, very peculiar. So we got that patient had malaria infection, and I got another case from the laboratory records. I wrote it up with the finding. Not only that, I looked into the very diligently all the sections in the parasite, all the paraffin sections of the malaria case, and I found indeed malaria parasite within the choroidal blood vessels. And this was published in the Ophthalmology Journal. What I feel is that when you want something, sometimes somewhere all the universe conspires in helping you to achieve it. So we also published in parasitic uveitis like intraocular Gnathostoma spinogerum, 2 cases. Many of us seen parasite in the eye, but I took it and I documented the case and then took to the botany department of Madras University for electron microscopy. And this was the first time that electron microscopy was done. It was a well-documented case, not only showing the anterior chamber infestation of the parasite, but also the crack which the parasite has produced, and also the parasite in the vitreous cavity, as well as the membranes inside the vitreous cavity. This is a weight mount preparation of the parasite and the scanning electron microscopy and histopathology of the photograph of the parasite. The most turning point, the most important turning point in my academic career is my fellowship in ophthalmic pathology, which I was fortunate to work under Professor Narsingh Rao between 1987 to 1989, which opened the horizon of my outlook in the academic world. I had learned a lot from him, and I started working in the pathology of the uveitis, biopsy pathology of the uveitis, and seen on the cases like pseudohypopian, lens-induced uveitis, large cell lymphoma. So my work could not have been, journey would not be possible without the help of my mentor, beloved chief, Dr. Badrinath, S.S. Badrinath, and my other mentor, Professor Narsingh Rao from Doheny Eye Institute, University of Southern California, and a lot of others whom I have got privilege to work with it. Some of them are fellows, and some of them are consultant. Of course, my teammates, which has helped us a lot. I will never forget my photographer, Professor Mr. S.P. Govindarajan, who diligently worked for me and helped me a lot to document the cases. And last but not the least, my wife, who tolerated me and long hours of my work. And in fact, she helped me in writing my first international publication, Primary Non-Familial Amyloidosis of the Victors. I remember I was so passionate about it. I wrote 7 pages. Reviewer asked me to write to it within the 1 page. I simply couldn't do it. I was so attached to the article. My wife cut it off and put it in the 1 page, and it got published. Now I like to share my thoughts on publications in peer-reviewed journals. There is an adage that publish or perish. I say that it's a publish and prosper. I believe that a scientific work, no matter how spectacular the findings are, is not complete until it is published. The scientist must not only do research, but also must write up the research works to communicate with others. So what is required? Enthusiasm, persistence, strong commitment, and last but not the least is passion for it. Why you do it? What is in it for you? It's aged in history, persists forever. Publication is the gold standard of the research, learning from the literature review, learning from the review process which you get, and knowledge get crystallized in the process. I started the baby steps. First wrote in the House Journal of Netrala Insight, then in Tamil Nadu Ophthalmic Journal, and I'm still learning in spite of writing in several peer-reviewed journals, PubMed Index. This is the journal which I published my first article, Netrala Insight. And then subsequently with the knowledge and all, I could write a practical suggestion in the writing of a research paper. The way forward, I like to share my view. What I'm doing now is ASOCTA, retinal vasculitis and choroiditis, metabolic biomarkers in uveitis with the help of the genetics department and biochemistry department, metagenomic deep sequencing in intraocular fluid in uveitis with the help of our molecular biology department, and with the rheumatologist help, I was trying to do that. I'm trying to do the new biologics in uveitis. This is a ASOCTA picture of an Eales disease patient showing elegantly neovascularization of the retina. I am also trying to correlate with multimodal imaging with ASOCTA, and you can see the flow void areas in the bottom, and this which disappears after the treatment with the immunosuppressive treatment. And these are the cases of that of autofluorescence, fluorescent angiogram, ICG, and OCT. So what I feel that we need to collaborate more. National and international collaborative research work is needed today. Analysis of the big data, artificial intelligence, proteomics in uveitis, metabolic biomarkers, new imaging technique, next generation sequencing, and targeted and local therapy. And many of us are doing it. I'm quite happy. Artificial intelligence and deep learning in ophthalmology will come in big way in the coming years. And there is some of the markers we can find out probably like an MYD88L265 mutations in intraocular lymphoma, which we have worked it out with a sensitivity of 88.9%, specificity of 91.6%. Some of the new markers we might find it non-infectious or non-infectious uveitis. Some of us doing the protein biomarkers in uveitis, or animal models of some uveitic entity which can provide us a diagnosis and treatment for the uveitis prevalent in our country. And the metagenomic deep sequencing, which can identify the common and rare pathogens which are not aware of, many in uveitis, which can be new vista of diagnosis. So other way is to looking into that one revising the diagnosis by peripheral blood transcriptomics and whole genome sequencing, which would come in the patients with infectious or non-infectious uveitis. So I like to end my talk with a quotation from T.H. Huxley: "The known is finite, the unknown is infinite. Intellectually, we stand on an islet in the midst of ocean of inexplicability. Our business in every generation is to reclaim a little more land." And this is the duty of all of us. And the way forward is this. Thank you very much.
Thank Thank you very much, sir, for the excellent inspirational talk on research in UVITs. I'm sure a lot more youngsters will get inspired to start a research career in UVITs. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
We'll move on to the next talk. The next talk is on laboratory investigations in scleritis, tailor-made approach. It's going to be by Dr. Partho Pratim Datta Majumdar. I invite Dr. Partho to speak on investigations in scleritis. Dr. Partho has a website called eAFTA. It will be of interest for the postgraduates. You can look into the site. Thank you. Over to Dr. Partho.
Thank you, Dr. Padma. So first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Somashila and team AIOS for inviting me to this excellent and session on uveitis. So I'll be talking on investigations in scleritis. So first, my one message to the audience, like if you have any query and it remains unanswered, or somebody who is watching this recorded version of the program maybe later, so I'll be happy to take any question. You can drop me a mail at drparthopratim@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer. So first of all, why we need to investigate a case of scleritis? The reason is approximately half of the patients can have an underlying systemic disorder. And if you diagnose this disorder and start effective treatment, many of such conditions, which are lethal disease, can save not only the eye, but also life of the patient. So always investigate a patient with scleritis. Now, why scleritis and systemic rheumatic disease? The reason is the sclera, cartilages, bones, ligaments, tendons, dermis, and leptomeninges are of same embryological origin from the neural crest and the mesoderm. Similarly, the gene expression pattern of human sclera is similar to that of the cartilage, and there are several common proteins or the biomarkers that are present in the sclera and synovium. Now, management of scleritis is like solving a jigsaw puzzle. You need a multidisciplinary approach and a proper balance and good teamwork between a rheumatologist and ophthalmologist. So as I said, it requires like step-by-step overview, like meticulous history, ocular systemic examination, and laboratory investigation. So before laboratory investigation, you have to perform these steps. So most important is history taking. You have to take history of surgery trauma because this can be a case of infectious scleritis. The joint pain and the joint stiffness, you have to note the symmetry, the duration of the joint pain, and activity, how whether it worsens with activity or not. Then similarly, several signs you have to elicit, and also the drug is very important. So drug history is very important to elicit or diagnose the drug-induced scleritis, especially the biphosphonate, which can cause scleritis in the elderly patients. Now, the subtype of scleritis is very important. One phenotype I just want to highlight here. We did a study in 140 eyes of 123 patients with nodular scleritis, and there we found that the presumed ocular TB is very common in this category. So always rule out TB in India if you are dealing with a case of scleral node. So before proceeding to the laboratory investigation, identify the red flag signs of scleritis. So three red flag signs are, the first one is peripheral corneal involvement. If a warning sign, because there are increased likelihood if it is associated with peripheral corneal involvement. So scleritis plus peripheral corneal involvement, always investigate aggressively, because there are several studies showed that it has a systemic association with the systemic vasculitis cases. Next important one is the scleral necrosis. It as much high as 95% systemic association has been found. So next time you can see a case of necrotizing scleritis, investigate aggressively. The third point is the severe symptoms. When you see a case of scleritis which has a severe out of proportion symptoms than to clinical signs, always do an aggressive investigation. Try to evaluate for the ANCAs, because many of the time this can be ANCA associated vasculitis. Now, most important step before ordering laboratory investigation is look for systemic signs. If you remember, the Sherlock Holmes told to Watson, you see, but you don't observe. So this happens in clinical practice also. So sometimes we forgot to examine this subtle clinical side. Sometimes it can be inflamed auricle. Sometimes it can be the depressed nasal breach, which we don't pay attention. Sometimes it can be the butterfly rashes. Similarly, sometimes we miss this nodules over the bony prominences, the rheumatoid nodules, which indicates that these are the signs of the long-standing rheumatoid arthritis. Similarly, the other signs of systemic vasculitis like necrotic digit and all, no, you have to look for them before ordering investigation. Now, coming to the biomarkers in scleritis, broadly, the broad biomarkers can be defined as a measured characteristic which can be used to indicate the biological state or a disease. So we'll discuss here the rheumatoid factor, anti-nuclear antibody, the ANCAs, and HLA-B27. But before that, remember, no single test is diagnostic and specific, and there is no standard battery of tests for scleritis. You have to come across three scenarios. The scenario one, the patient presents with scleritis, there is no signs of systemic disease. You start the patient on treatment and then send to rheumatologist. The biomarker is positive. There are definite signs of systemic disease, and that's a happy clinical scenario. You can continue the treatment under the supervision of a rheumatologist. The scenario one here, there are so many conditions: rheumatoid arthritis, granulomatous polyangiitis, also known as Wegener granulomatosis, relapsing polychondritis, and systemic lupus erythematosus. The scenario two is like you have a scleritis, there is no scleritis, patient is already a known systemic disease like rheumatoid arthritis with a positive biomarker, and the patient comes to you with scleritis. Very easy to treat these patients. You already know the systemic disease. So the most commonly seen in this kind of scenario too is seen in rheumatoid arthritis, where the scleritis occurs after the diagnosis, and severity of the scleritis can often carry a very important prognostic message. So you have to tell this to your rheumatologist, because if there is a severe scleral disease, it indicates the severe disease in the form of joint and vascular involvement. Also, there are higher incidences of ocular complications. So you have to tell your rheumatology friend to start aggressive treatment. And these patients have a higher mortality rate. So naturally, you have to convey it to your rheumatologist. So the scenario three is the most difficult. The first, the patient presents with scleritis in the clinic. No signs of systemic disease. The scleritis, the biomarker is you term it as idiopathic. Often what happens, the patient is lost to follow-up. If you can follow the patient for a long time, you can actually see that after a variable period of time, this patient can become positive and their biomarkers can be found positive. So this scenario three, which often we term them as a idiopathy. So the most common cause here is GPA, the granulomatous polyangiitis or the mitosis. The patients here are GPA and ANCA negative. Can I take 1 more minute?
Sure, Dr. Patil.
So the anti-nuclear antibody. So the third scenario, the most common example is the Wegener granulomatosis. Coming to the ANA, you have to understand that not only positive, you need to have a higher dilution like 1:160, which makes this highly suggestive. Coming to the rheumatoid factor, the only presence of rheumatoid factor is not enough because it can be seen in many conditions. And there are some ACPAs, the anti-citrullinated antibodies, which is found to be associated with seropositive, more erosive disease. But in scleritis, we don't see any such association. HLA-B27 has been labeled as a second or third most common cause of scleritis, so we should investigate them. Coming to the anti-nuclear neutrophilic cytoplasmic antibody, it has a limited role only if you look into the positive ANCA test, because it has positive predictive value of 63. That means there are chances that 30% of cases, if you only rely on the positive ANCA, you can wrongly diagnose the GPA. We did a study where in 33 eyes of 26 patients with ANCA positive scleritis, the tuberculosis was the second most common. So you have to understand that there can be a cross-reactivity of neutrophils with this microbacterial cell wall, which can give to wrongly the ANCA positivity. So be careful treating such patients with high aggressive immune suppressive in a TB endemic country. So just to finish my talk, that remember while investigating a case of scleritis, you have to recognize the subtypes of the scleritis. Remember, history taking is the most important step in uveitis and scleritis. Recall the majority of the diagnoses are clinical, and rule the laboratory clinic, don't be slave of it, and refer to a rheumatologist, internist, or to your colleague when you are in doubt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Partho. Since we are running late, we will move on to the next talk. The next talk is on practical approach in laboratory investigations in anterior uveitis by Dr. Amitabh Kumar from Calcutta. Over to Dr. Amitabh.
Yeah, good afternoon. At the very outset, I would like to thank the scientific committee for giving me this opportunity. We know that laboratory investigations in uveitis, they are not a panacea, and they do not elbow out our
slideshow mode.
Hello.
Slideshow mode.
Yeah, and they don't elbow out our clinical acumen. They are just tools to help us in trying to solve the jigsaw puzzle, which uveitis is. I have no financial interest in my presentation. So why would we do laboratory tests? So it would be to identify presumed autoimmune disease, to identify specific uveitic entities, and to obtain diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic directions. But having said that, I don't think we should go for a fishing expedition. So there could be two approaches, a completely empirical approach or a totally lab-dependent approach. But I think the most practical approach is a tailored lab investigation on a case-to-case basis. So there are certain conditions of anterior uveitis where we may not need any investigations, like a Fuchs uveitis, a traumatic uveitis, and probably the first attack of an acute non-granulomatous anterior uveitis. So before we order investigations, after a detailed history and a complete examination, we would want to come to a working clinical diagnosis in our office and try and shortlist etiological possibilities, fit this into the phenotypes available, and then order only relevant lab investigations first. For example, if we have this patient, an angry looking eye with a fibrin in the anterior chamber, we know a working clinical diagnosis is an acute unilateral non-granulomatous anterior uveitis. And similarly, this patient with mud and fat keratic precipitates, this would be an acute granulomatous anterior uveitis because we would tailor our investigations accordingly. So we know when we are dealing with anterior uveitis, first of all, we would try to figure out whether it's a uveitic entity or a non-uveitic entity. And if uveitic, whether anterior uveitis is granulomatous or non-granulomatous. And it is imperative to try and figure out whether it's infectious or non-infectious. Uveitis masquerade can masquerade, and especially if you have uveitis at the extremes of age, that should raise a red flag. So investigations in anterior uveitis could be ocular or non-ocular, invasive or non-invasive. So this young male with a unilateral acute non-granulomatous anterior uveitis alternating between the two eyes with a hypopyon, I think the only test which we would need to order first is an HLA-B27. On the other hand, another hypopyon, because anterior uveitis could be an indicator of something ominous happening in the back part of the eye. So after detailed examination, if there is a posterior segment involvement, like in this patient, probably we would like to rule out Behçet's and order for an HLA-B51. If we have a patient with these nodules, the Kopis, the Busaka's nodules, and the isolated nodules like this, we know that we are dealing with a granulomatous anterior uveitis, and we would want to rule out the common granulomatous etiologies of tuberculosis and sarcoidosis. So a tuberculin skin test could be positive in 30 to 69% of healthy Indians, or it could be negative or weakly positive in 33% of TB patients. The other tests available is a quantiferon TB Gold test, which is sensitive in identifying latent TB. The other imaging in tuberculosis could be a chest X-ray or an HRCT chest, which would show a tree in the bud appearance. And in case there's a doubt, subject the patient to an anterior chamber tap and send the aqueous sample for a PCR for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. If we have a high index of suspicion for sarcoidosis, we would order for a serum ACE and also calcium and phosphorus. We know that serum ACE levels would be high in active sarcoidosis, but a normal value would not exclude sarcoidosis. And patients on systemic steroids may have a false negative value. If we combine a serum ACE with gallium scan, the specificity can go up as high as 100%. So the imaging in sarcoidosis could be chest X-ray or an HRCT, which would show bilateral hilar lymphadenopathy. And if you have lymph nodes, you can do an FNAB or an EBUS TBNA and come to a tissue diagnosis of a non-caseating granuloma. Now, if we have a patient like this, we know with these kind of skin eruptions and anterior uveitis, and especially a sectoral iris atrophy, we are more or less sure that we are dealing with a viral uveitis, and probably they may not require any investigations. Whereas this patient with a steamy cornea, diffuse pigmented keratic precipitates, this again is a viral uveitis with a raised intraocular pressure, and an aqueous tap and an RT-PCR revealed an HSV1 for this patient. Now, if you have a hypopyon like this with an intraocular lens and a history of a recent cataract surgery, obviously we would not be investigating this patient for any uveitic etiology, but we would like to rule out an acute postoperative endophthalmitis. Another pseudophakic patient was being treated with steroids for chronic postoperative uveitis, not responding. So this is where investigations would really help us. So an AC tap from this patient revealed a P. acnes. So this was a low-grade endophthalmitis. Now, syphilis can cause any kind of uveitis. It's a great mimicker. So we would like to do one a non-treponemal test like a VDRL or RPR, and another treponemal test like a TPHA or FTA-ABS. Diagnostic dilemmas are not very uncommon in uveitis, and these are areas where lab investigations would help us in trying to get to the cause. This was a 32-year-old man with hypopyon and was not responding to topical and systemic steroids, and an AC tap revealed a microfilaria. Another 8-year-old girl with a persistent hypopyon uveitis, not responding to topical and systemic steroids, and this turned out to be a retinoblastoma. A 55-year-old male with bilateral hypopyon, his peripheral blood count showed a CML. So just to wrap up, to conclude that laboratory investigations not only help us in the diagnosis, but we may have to investigate these patients with their routine bloods, their liver and renal profile, because we might need to initiate this patient on medications which have potential systemic toxicity. So if we have a patient like this who has an acute non-granulomatous anterior uveitis, what tests would we order? Probably an ESR, an HLA-B27, and an ANA. On the other hand, a granulomatous anterior uveitis, we would want to do ESR, a MANTO, a quantiferon TB gold test, serum ACE, and image them with either a chest X-ray or an HRCT. So a practical approach for investigations in anterior uveitis is neither a totally empirical approach nor a lab-dependent approach, but with a middle path with a tailored lab investigations on a case-to-case basis. Thank you for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Amitabh, for the very nice presentation. And thank you for sticking on to the time. You saved the extra 1 minute in your talk. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next, I invite Dr. Samyak Mulkadkar to speak on what should I investigate in intermediate, posterior, and pan uveitis. Dr. Samyak is from Mumbai. Over to Dr. Samyak.
Thank you, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we are able.
Yes. All right. Okay. A lot of my slides would be overlapping in whatever number of presentations we have seen. Rather than a blanket testing, we would want to have a tailored or a targeted testing, like my previous speaker also has said. Let us look at a few case scenarios in the posterior uveitis or intermediate uveitis and pan uveitis. This is the first scenario where you see focal necrotizing retinitis right in the macula, very close to the fovea. And this is very much a clinical diagnosis of toxoplasma retinochoroiditis. You usually do not require any tests to start on the treatment, but in atypical cases, you might go for typing the antitoxo antibodies. And in rare cases, you also may require a TAP to prove that it's a PCR. You do not require a MON2 test at this stage, or you do not require any chest CT or a chest imaging at this stage. If you see focal retinal exudates, if you see vitreous exudates, if you see a lot of vitritis, significant amount of vitritis, then you know that you should look for any infections. You should do a CBC, ESR, blood cultures, probably urine cultures, and also look at having a vitreous tap or a PCR, a cultures. And you should also consult an infectious disease specialist, because this may be one of the features of endogenous endophthalmitis. Let us look at scenario 2, where you have bilateral exudative retinal detachments along with yellowish subretinal lesions with granulomatous panuveitis. This is again a clinical diagnosis, most likely to be VKH syndrome. You have to corroborate that evidence by an audiometry, or you can do a CSF tap to see for pleocytosis. You do not actually need any investigations from the laboratory end. You do need the imaging. You can do an FFA or an ICG, OCT, the EDI, and you can actually diagnose the disease. If you look at a case of treated uveitis where you have the sunset glow fundus, you have to remember that this could be one of the cases where the immunosuppression has been stopped or the steroids have been stopped, and the corroborative evidence will be alopecia or poliosis or vitiligo. So again, this will not require any specific laboratory investigations. Like was cited in the previous talks, that evidence of pain or a T sign on the ultrasound can be quite suggestive of posterior scleritis. And that is the time when you will have to, in conjunction with your hematologist colleague, you will have to order for all the other investigations like the ANA, CNP, NCAS, DNA, RA factor, and so on and so forth. Now, the other common scenario is that if you see multiple choroidal granulomas, either unilateral or bilateral, you see choroiditis along with vasculitis, with or without associated vasculitis, or if you see serpiginous-like choroiditis or multifocal serpiginoid choroiditis, then you know that these are all signs predictive of TB uveitis. Go for a MON2 test or a tuberculin skin test. You also evaluate the chest imaging. You probably, the HRCT chest or as contrast enhanced is more sensitive than a chest X-ray. You also have to rule out sarcoid. So the ACE levels and the other associated tests have to be done. TPHA has to be done because it may mimic, it's a great mimicker as we know. IGRA test or a TB quantiferon test can be done. CT guided biopsy may be needed in cases of to prove that it is either TB or what kind of a granulomatous inflammation it is. A PCR test for vitreous can be done as it has to be stepped up, or a PET CT can be required. In case of intermediate uveitis, where you have vitritis, cystoid macular edema, multiple snowballs, you require the same kind of investigations to rule out either a TB or a sarcoid. Very rarely, you may have to ask for an MRI brain if the patient has any associated neurological symptoms, because intermediate uveitis has also been reported to occur in multiple sclerosis. If you go to scenario 4, if you see such kind of multiple areas of confluent retinal necrosis, either in the periphery or in the posterior pole with a varying amount of vitritis, could be either acute retinal necrosis or progressive autoretinal necrosis. If you see it in a PISA-Y kind of a pattern with multiple retinal hemorrhages, then you have to, it's a clinical diagnosis of a CMV retinitis. And then you have to look for an immune compromised state or any immune suppressed state. Also do an HLA, also do the serology, the HIV, HBsAg, HCV, TPHA definitely. And if it's a CMV retinitis, then you need to go for a CMV viral load. You need an infectious disease specialist in conjunction for treatment of this patient. Coming to scenario 5, you may see this kind of a picture where you have significant vitritis occluding your view of the fundus. multiple cotton wool spots, multiple superficial retinal hemorrhages. The angiogram might show extensive leakage from all vessels. Again, you may not see choroiditis in such a patient. So in this case, a classical history of an oral or a genital ulceration, hypopyon in the anterior chamber can be quite leading to the diagnosis of Behçet's disease. However, you need to rule out TB or sarcoid in such cases because you can have overlapping symptoms. You need to involve a rheumatologist or an internist because any other things can be evaluated from that perspective. If there has been a history of a fever before the presentation of ocular symptoms, then the PCR for dengue or chikungunya has also been emphasized in literature. Very, very atypical cases of toxoplasmosis have been seen to present with vascular occlusion and vasculitis, so they also have to be kept in mind. Similar looking picture with multiple cotton wool spots or occlusive vascular occlusion at multiple levels, but without any vitreous inflammation. Then most of these patients will be either patients whom the rheumatologist has been treating or patients with SLE or any other systemic connective tissue disease. So you have to be in you have to speak to the rheumatologist and you can get these tests done. Otherwise, you also have to rule out, very rarely you may need to require the other tests for TB and sarcoid to be ruled out. There are unusual presentations for this. For example, unusual presentation like this is the case of syphilis, the case of SSPE, or you may have masquerades with who present with ALL or lymphoma. But then these you have to go in a stepwise approach and in a stepwise ladder approach so that you can see what actually is happening. So the take-home message is that you need a targeted history. After naming and meshing, you need to order tailored investigation in the stepladder approach and rule out infection first. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Samyak, for the nice presentation. Next, we'll move on to the next talk is on imaging techniques in uveitis using FFA and ICG. Dr. Mamta will be speaking on this topic. Over to Dr. Mamta.
Hi, Padma. Can I share my screen?
Yes.
Can they see my slides? Can we see? No.
We could see the pointer in the blank screen.
Yeah, not yet.
One second.
Ma'am, open your first
So,
PPT.
yes. So just to guide you, ma'am, you have to first open your presentation. And when you click on share, you would be able to see the presentation.
Can you
Yes,
see?
it is visible. Yes.
Can I just start it?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Padma, for having me here. I would also like to thank the AIOS Scientific Committee for giving this opportunity to share my experience with imaging techniques in uveitis. I'll be talking about fundus fluorescein angiography and indocyanine beam angiography. So as we have all seen through the talk since morning, uveitis, we all know anterior, intermediate, posterior, and panuveitis. But when we know the diagnosis, we need clinical findings, lab tests, ancillary tests, and also pathology in some cases to reach a conclusion. And these are some of the pictures, clinical pictures, which show different kinds of intermediate, posterior, and panuveitis. We'll be seeing in the coming slides. So the ancillary test, we have a list, but what begins for posterior uveitis is fluorescein angiography and ICG in my presentation. Fluorescein angiography, it includes an orange dye, which absorbs light in the blue spectrum and emits green light. The compound is 80% bound, we know, and 20% is unbound. What does it do? It images the retinal circulation and the superficial retina, but also the retinal pigment epithelium, choriocapillaries, subretinal and choroidal structures. It's a simple procedure, but it does have few complications that patient might say he's feeling nauseated, vomiting, allergy, and sometimes a vasovagal attack can also be there. It's contraindicated, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy and patients with renal disease. So how do we interpret fluorescein angiography? There are 4 phases. The choroidal phase is first 10 to 15 seconds of injection, which images the choroid and optic nerve. It is followed by the rapid arterial phase and then arteriovenous phase, which shows the laminar filling. And then there is a recirculation phase, and it's usually completed by 10 minutes. How do we interpret it? As we see, it can be a dark spot or it can be a hyperspot. The hypofluorescence means it's a blob fluorescence, or it can be just a filling defect due to ischemia. And the hyperfluorescence, as we see in all the pictures on the right, it can be a leakage, as we see the optic disc leakage. It can be staining of the vessels. It can be pooling in the subretinal space, or it can be an increased transmission, as we see in this, and abnormal vessels neovascularization. So the clinical applications, I will just compile. It shows optic disc inflammation, macular edema, retinal vasculitis, neovascularations, and few others. Let's see through the slides. It confirms a clinical diagnosis. And how is that? This is a patient with serpiginous choroiditis, which is the inflammation of the inner choroid and RPE. And what we see in the early phase is a hypopatch followed by a hyperpatch. This is a patient with VKH disease. It's a classical thing where we see small hypospots and then pooling in the late phase, and it's a glassy pattern of hyperfluorescence. Similarly, sympathetic ophthalmia, what we see is pinpoint hyperfluorescent lesions in the early phase, and this is called a starry night, and then again pooling in the late phase. So these are quite classical features of both VKH and sympathetic ophthalmia. How about toxoplasmic retinochoroiditis? Do we really need to do an FA in these patients? It's a clinical diagnosis, but to know more about the pathology and how the organism has affected our retina, we need to do an FA. Look at this. What we see here is a enlarged FAZ. And here we can see the vasculitis and macular ischemia. So this tells us that it does not only causes necrosis of the retina, but it is also affecting the adjoining vessels to tell us more about the pathology. So what if it is a clinical finding which is not so obvious? How about this VKH? It's a fundus which is absolutely a sunset. We don't know what's going on in the macula. Patient complains of decreased vision, and what we see here is a macular edema, cystoid pattern. And similarly, an intermediate uveitis is not only just the pars plana involvement. When we do an FA, we can see the disc leakage and also the macula, which is affected here. Similarly, a pseudophakic cystoid macular edema, it looks so crystal clear with no vitritis. But at FA, it picks up the perifoveal leakage and accumulation of the cystoid spaces. Similarly, retinal vasculitis here, it just shows diffuse hemorrhages. We are not seeing any vascular cuffing, but what we do see is diffuse leakage, which guides us that how should we treat the patient. And as we treat it with steroids, all the hemorrhages and the vasculitis disappears. And this is another patient in retinal vasculitis. We pick up more of CNP areas and neovascularization on FA. We also helps us to grade the inflammation. As we see in this intermediate uveitis, the vasculitis component is more easily seen on FA. Similarly here, a panuveitis, it may look very clear, or it may look just normal on OCT with a mild cyst, but in FA picks up much more than what we see clinically. How about neuroretinitis? Is it optic nerve or is it the vessels also involved? So what we are seeing, the vessels are absolutely okay here, but it's the disc which is blooming up. It also helps to monitor the disease intensity and modulate our treatment. Like this patient with Behçet's disease now comes after two courses of steroids. But when we do an FA, we do find that there is neovascularization and he needs additional laser besides anti-inflammatory therapy. And how about this toxo patient? This is at presentation and this is at 6 weeks. Now, should we continue steroids? Should we not? When we do an FA, we don't see vasculitis now. So we can go down on our anti-inflammatory therapy looking at the FA pictures. And how about this? A patient with juxtapapillary CNVM. Patient is already on steroids. But now what next should we do? So when we do this FA, we can see blooming in the late phase, a classically active papillary CNVM. So we need to give anti-VEGF here besides anti-inflammatory therapy. And how about this patient? Do we always need to treat the patient? I think no. When we do an FA and we just see these window defects and RP alterations with no leakage through the vessels or the disc, we can stop our anti-inflammatory therapy. So what next? It is the ICG, which is Actually, it fluoresces at a longer wavelength and it penetrates the RPE to visualize choroid. It is read in two phases, early, middle phase and the late phases, and primarily for the choroidal lesions. As we see here, this is a patient of serpiginous like choroiditis. The right eye was normal now, healed, but he comes after 7 years with active lesions in the left eye. And what we see is much more, as we see on the bottom right, much more lesions on ICG than what we see on FA. Here's another patient with choroidal granuloma, which see 2 lesions on fundus ophthalmoscopy, another 2 on FA. But what we can see is more hyperlipidemia on the ICG picture. And this is, in conclusion, I would say that these are the investigations which are important tools for intermediate, posterior, and pan-uveitis. Gives always a better understanding of the disease pathology, and it helps in monitoring our diseases and guides us definitely to treat our patients. How much is the dose of steroids and how much should we give the immunomodulatory therapy? So these are basic tools, but very important in a uveitis clinic. Thank you so much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Mamta, for the illustrative talk. Next, I invite my co-moderator, Dr. Aniruddha, to the session. I invite him to speak on OCT and UPTI in uveitis. Over to Dr. Aniruddha.
Thank you, ma'am, for the introduction. I'm going to play my presentation. Please let me know if it is visible. Very good afternoon. My name is Aniruddha Agarwal, and I'm at the Cleveland Clinic, Abu Dhabi. At the outset, I would like to thank the Scientific Committee of All India Ophthalmic Society for this opportunity to present my talk on OCT and OCTA in uveitis. Imaging in uveitis is such a broad concept. And in the next 8 minutes, I would like to cover a few entities in uveitis that we commonly analyze using OCT and OCT angiography. White dot syndromes consisting of serpiginous choroiditis and multifocal choroiditis are the most important and common entities that we encounter and can be assessed using these imaging tools. The other entities such as punctate inner-choroidopathy and MUDES are not so commonly encountered in our subcontinent. This is a classic case of a young male with bilateral diminution of vision. And as you can see, there is serpiginous choroiditis because of TB, and you have the classic yellowish serpentine lesions on the fundus in the macula, and autofluorescence imaging shows you that these lesions are hyperautofluorescent, which means that they are active. The right eye also has lesions, especially involving the fovea and vision-threatening lesions, which are active and hyperautofluorescent. In these patients, when we perform a combined fluorescein and indocyanine green angiography, we realize that on fluorescein angiography, some of the macular lesions may be difficult to detect in the early phase, and there is leakage from the lesions. And ICG angiography is very useful in delineating the choroiditis and the involvement of the choriocapillaries. And it appears as hypofluorescence on ICG, indicating that the choriocapillaries flow is compromised. This is a blown up picture of ICG. And as you can see that this exactly correlates with the OCT angiography image. And you can see that the lesions of choriocapillaries are so clearly demarcated on OCTA imaging. When OCTA was initially launched a few years ago, this was a very useful entity because on OCTA, we could confirm the presence of choriocapillaritis and inner ischemia of the choroid. And there was exact correspondence to ICGA. And we published these findings in the Journal of Retina in 2017. Subsequently, we realized that when you do a follow-up imaging in these patients, ICG imaging shows you a near complete resolution of the choriocapillaries hypoperfusion. As you can see, it's not very easy to perform a repeat fluorescein and ICG for all our patients. And therefore, when you compare the ICG, it's a great thing to have to see the choriocapillaries recover. But you can also do this non-invasively on OCT angiography. And you can see that there is near complete resolution of the choriocapillaries flow except for some disturbance in the center of the lesion. So this is a very important learning lesson for us, that healing of choroiditis lesions is accompanied by reduction in the choriocapillaries flow deficit area. And we realize that if the lesion itself is less than 0.1 millimeter square in size, they tend to resolve with minimum flow void areas. And this was subsequently published in 21 April issue of Retina journal this year. And as you can see that you can have a very good follow-up imaging using OCT angiography in patients with choroiditis. Placoid lesions can also be imaged using OCT angiography. And you can see, as if you focus on the panel towards the right, you can see that the edges of the lesion which appear hypo-reflective on OCT angiography, they tend to resolve on the follow-up imaging, which is down at the bottom on the right. And this indicates that the choriocapillaries have recovered, although there is central choriocapillaries atrophy, and you can see the underlying choroidal vessels. This is a patient who has a classic appearance of AP-MPPE on ICG imaging. And as you can see, there is ellipsoid zone disruption, photoreceptor disruption, and a large placoid lesion. And as you can see, the ICG correlates exactly very well with the OCT angiography imaging, very much like choroiditis lesions. So the pattern of choriocapillaries flow deficit exactly matches with the ICG, and you can use the OCT angiography to monitor these patients. This is our learning lesson number 2. VKH is a very commonly encountered disease. And as you can see, this is a classic textbook picture patient where you have choroidal granulomas imaged using ICG imaging, and you have on fluorescein multifocal pockets of serous retinal detachment. Now, when you do an OCT, and this is a recent description from our group, that these patients have what is called as the bacillary layer detachment. Essentially, if you focus on the image number B, you realize that the arrow, which is termed as BLD, is the bacillary layer. It simply indicates a split in the myoid zone of photoreceptors. And as you can see at the bottom of this hyporeflective space, you have the ellipsoid zone, which is relatively intact. This has been termed as the bacillary layer detachment. And this, if you look at the figure D, separates a serous retinal detachment, that is SRD, from intraretinal fluid. Now, this is not something which is new, because compartmentalization of fluid was always known to happen in VKH, and only now we are calling it as bacillary layer detachment. The main utility of this sign is that it indicates presence of an underlying inflammatory pathology. And this is something that you will not see commonly at all in CSC patients or other patients who have non-inflammatory causes of serous retinal detachment. And this was subsequently published. Finally, I would like to talk about utility of OCT and other imaging tools in distinguishing between choroidal granulomas. Now, granulomas of the choroid, including TB and sarcoid, present a diagnostic challenge. And so in these patients, it's very useful to have, in addition to lab help with multimodal imaging. If you see this particular OCT, you see a very large choroidal granuloma, which is causing a bump and elevation of the RPE. This is a patient who has TB choroidal granuloma. And one of the very useful ways to identify this is by the presence of this oblong or a very large choroidal granuloma filling almost the entire choroidal space. And if you see the first figure on the left, you have this fuzzy infiltration of the outer retina. This is a very common feature of TB, where you have fuzzy infiltration of the retina. And as you can see that the arrows are pointing towards the infiltration of the retina at the bottom below. This outer retinal infiltration can differentiate TB from sarcoidosis. And in fact, this has a very strong p-value. And TB choroidal granulomas have characteristic outer retinal involvement, which is not seen in sarcoid. This is a patient who has sarcoidosis. Now, in the lesions which are sarcoidosis, they have very small choroidal granulomas. And these patients tend to have a rounded lesions without much overlying fluid or exudation. This is in contrast to patients of TB that we just saw. And therefore, OCT is very useful in detecting these lesions of choroiditis and distinguishing between the etiology. Of course, they do not replace the lab evaluation, but it's very useful for us to have OCT imaging in order to aid the diagnosis. With this, I'd like to thank everyone for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Aniruddha, for that excellent talk. We'll take up the questions at the end after finishing all the talk so that we can adjust the timings. Yeah. Next talk is on HRCT and PET-CT scan in uveitis. We invite Dr. Salil Mehta from Mumbai to speak on this topic. Over to Dr. Salil.
Yeah, hold on, let me just share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Sir, it's downloading. We are yet to see the screen.
Yes,
Yes, it is up now. Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, thanks so much, Somshila. She has done a brilliant job in putting this entire day together, and thanks for putting up with all my constant messages throughout the day. So today I've been asked to speak on HRCT and PET-CT in uveitis. And what I've decided to do is just show you some of the cases that I have treated so far and what I have learned from each of them. So when you analyze any standard textbook of uveitis, and especially as in India, it's infectious uveitis that comes first. And when you talk about tuberculosis, they write about the first thing that everybody talks about is chest X-ray, Mantoux test, acid fast staining, cultures, nucleic acid amplifications. Now, this culture of chest X-ray has unfortunately been deeply embedded in India, and I want to show you why it should not be so. So this is a very standard chest X-ray that we have all learned from our MBBS days. This is, of course, a CT scan. So, okay, let's see. This is a 27-year-old female who has come with me, who has come with acute pain, redness, reduced vision in the right eye since 7 days. You can see that there's a very classical string of pearls appearance in the inferior vitreous along with a significant vitreous haze. You see her chest X-ray, completely normal. And you can see the arrows of the HRCT, which shows extensive mediastinal tuberculosis, mediastinal lymphadenopathy in the lower two pictures. You can see the red arrows showing the spots where there is like conglomerations of lymph nodes. Her Mantoux was very strongly positive. I gave her AKT steroids and she resolved fully. It's a 45-year-old male who has presented with non-resolving floaters in both eyes, also a history of recurrent anterior uveitis. Vision is 6/6 bilaterally, mild groin granulomatous AU. See this again, vitreous haze, string of pearls appearance. You can see this little balls of vitritis, balls of infection within the lower vitreous. I did HRCT, Mantoux is strongly positive, TB quantiferon gold is strongly positive. See this. Large conglomerate lymph nodes within the mediastinum, as you can see from the red arrows. But note how clear the lung fields are. There is no consolidation, there is no collapse, there is no infection of any of the lung fields. All you can see here is mediastinal lymph nodes. So from this and from many others, I have realized that HRCT is the investigation of choice for chest imaging. Chest X-rays do not even image 50% of the chest. The mediastinum cannot be studied at all because it is directly behind the sternum, which is radio opaque. And in Indian patients, especially patients who present with ocular tuberculosis, mediastinal disease is extremely common. Almost all of them, with very few examples, have got lymph node tuberculosis, which is only in the mediastinum. Lung fields are always clear. Let's see another patient. Recurrent anterior uveitis in the right eye. Vision is counting fingers in one eye. You can see that there's a vitreous hemorrhage in the right eye and a very subtle retinal vasculitis in the left eye. I've done an HRCT. You can see a large conglomerate mediastinal lymph node. But note how clear the lung fields are. There is absolutely nothing in the lung fields. If you had simply done a chest X-ray, you would have been fortunate just to find query a hilar knuckle, but the lung fields would have been reported as normal and you would have thought this is normal. Let's move on to PET-CT. Everybody knows that HRCT is only part of the solution. I believe the final solution will come from a PET-CT scan. So what it does, this PET-CT machine actually combines PET, that is positron emission tomography, and CT, and fuses the two images to give you a remarkable clear and accurate image. So let's see some images. A 55-year-old female, previously investigated, treated for sarcoidosis. Vision is very good, 6/9 both eyes, but subtle bilateral granulomatous anterior uveitis. This is her HRCT. Post contrast, you can see large conglomerate mediastinal nodes, as you can see by the red arrows. Now, this is her PET scan. In a PET scan, the lighter the area, the orange, the more orange it is, that the higher is the uptake of 18 FTG. So it means higher the metabolically active the tissue is. That means it takes up more of the radioactive marker, which is 18 FTG. So you can see here that there is left hilar and subcondylar metabolically active adenopathy. It's reported in terms of metabolic activity. So the greater the metabolic activity, the more active is the tissue. You can see here on the lower right image that there is a aortocoval adenopathy also which has been reported. I'll show you another 55-year-old patient, pain, redness, defective vision. Vision is 6/6, 6/12, serpiginous like choroidopathy in both retinas. This is the fundus photograph. You can see discrete and yet some discrete lesions and some lesions which are starting to merge into the others. MANTU is very high. Quantiferon gold is high, but HRCT is completely normal. You can see that there's a right paratracheal, precarinal, and bilateral lymph nodes. There is increased uptake, and there is also increased uptake in the left choroid. So this is one of the rare cases where I found where the HRCT was completely normal, but the PET-CT showed me findings. A 60-year-old man, discomfort, mild pain, vision is 6/6, mild non-granulomatous anterior uveitis. You can see that there are FTG avid mediastinal lymphadenopathy, pretracheal, precarinal, AP window, and subcarinal nodes. Notice at every patient how clear the lung fields are. And you can see exactly which nodes in the mediastinum are active and how active they are. This is a lady with panuveitis. You can just, I want you to see the uptake in the posterior half of both eyeballs. See the extensive mediastinal, pretracheal, and subcarinal nodes activity you can see here. Also, there is periportal adenopathy, bilateral external inguinal adenopathy here. So, in this lady had extensive disseminated tuberculosis with lymph node TB in multiple organ systems. And it is really important to know that one of the advantages of doing PET-CT, which I have found, is that you do. Can I just continue for a minute? Hello.
Sure, sir. You can wrap up in half a minute if possible. Thank you.
And so one of the advantages I found that when you have such disseminated disease, the more metabolically active the node that you detect on PET-CT, those are the best nodes to biopsy for the highest chances of having a positive yield. A last patient, she's come with a complicated cataract, very strongly positive MANTU, and you can see cervical and mediastinal lymphadenopathy, supraclavicular, paratracheal, subcarinal. So what I really want to prove is why should we do a PET-CT? It helps you identify areas of metabolic activity. Mostly it turns out to be lymph node tuberculosis. It has the best potential to find sites of biopsy, and you can genuinely track improvement over a period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And with this, we'll move to our next talk by Dr. Padma Malini ma'am. We all know that she's an internationally sought after speaker from Narayan Nethralaya. And ma'am will be speaking about multimodal imaging in uveitis case examples. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Anirudh. Share.
Ma'am, you can, yes, perfectly visible.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, I'd like to thank AIOC Scientific Committee and Dr. Somashila for inviting me here today to speak on multimodal imaging in case examples. Multimodal imaging, where we have combination of imaging methods, varies from color fundus photography, red-free imaging, fundus autofluorescence, and FFA to study the retinal circulation, ICG for the choroidal circulation. We have non-invasive imaging methods such as OCT and OCTA. All this can be done simultaneously at the point of interest in the same patient to study the pathology in depth. For the benefit of the postgraduates, I request them to go through this article, multimodal image of the normal eye. We need to know how the normal eye looks. From that, we can appreciate the pathological eye. Multimodal imaging applies not only to the posterior segment of the eye, it can be applied in the anterior segment as well. In multimodal imaging in uveitis, anterior segment, we have a photography, specular microscopy to study the endothelial cell count, especially before the cataract surgery or in complicated cataract surgeries. Then in vivo confocal microscopy, anterior segment OCT, ultrasound biomicroscopy, we have laser fluorimetry to quantify the inflammation and various imaging methods. This invasive angiography can be done, indocyanine green angiography can be done to study the iris circulation, and also we have iris and infrared imaging of the iris. So these are the various methods available to study. Now in multimodal imaging of the anterior segment, here we could see the various imaging methods. Here the confocal showing the various types of keratic precipitates, AS, OCT and UBM are there, and ICG, here you can see the ischemia and the iris margin. In the late phase, there is diffusion from the collateral vessels. We'll start with the case example. Here, 23-year-old female, bilateral panuveitis with suspected peripapillary CNVM in both eyes. OCT shows there is a break in the RPE-Brooks membrane with hyperreflective echoes in the outer retina, confirming the presence of CNVM. In the left eye, in addition to the break, you could see the fluid-filled cystic spaces within the retina as well. In addition to that, you could see the hyperreflective dots in the vitreous cavity suggestive of active inflammation. Here is a multimodal imaging. FFA shows hyperfluorescence in the peripapillary area. ICG shows, in addition to the peripapillary lesion, you could see multiple hypofluorescent dark dots, which shows extensive involvement of the choroid, showing active inflammation is happening. OCTA has 4 different layers. Here, the superficial vascular layer looks normal. In the deep capillary plexus, you could see the hyperfluorescence surrounding the area of hyperfluorescence. In the outer retina, we could see the presence of vessel complex. And this is the choroid has both hyper as well as hyperfluorescence, confirming the presence of choroidal neovascular membrane along with active uveitis in the right eye. The left eye also shows similar picture. Here the fovea is thin, so you could see the hyperfluorescence in the fovea. In addition to that, you could see multiple hyperfluorescent dark dots in the choroid. So here again, inflammations with CNVM is there in the peripapillary region. This particular patient's OCTA has been used for the follow-up. Here is a factorial analysis, shows increasing the vessel density and decreasing the space between the vessels, which help us to follow up in this case of the peripapillary CNVM. The next case is a case of a 32-year-old male, sudden decrease in vision since 1 week. The visual acuity at presentation was counting finger half meter in the right eye. When you look at it, you could see the annular opacification in the outer retina in the right eye. In the left eye had vitritis 1+, but the fundus grossly looks normal. But when we did the autofluorescence, you could see the areas of hyperautofluorescence mixed with hypoautofluorescence in the right eye. And here there is a hyperautofluorescent lesions, looks like a triangular patch like kind of a configuration. FFA showed disc leak, staining and leakage from the retinal vessels in both eyes. OCT shows, in addition to the posterior vitreous cells, there is a destruction of the outer retinal layers where you can see the distortion of the LM with the myoid ellipsoid zone alterations. Where the active edge is there, we could see it's not only the retina, but also the choroid is involved. Here again in the left eye, you could see the destruction of the outer retinal layers with increasing thickness of the choroid in addition to the retinal changes. So we made the diagnosis of retinochoroiditis based on the triangular patch of retinitis. What we are seeing on autofluorescence imaging made us to suspect the possibility of syphilis in the differential diagnosis, and that both TPHA as well as the BDRL was positive, HIV was negative, and this patient was treated with injection benzathine penicillin 24 lakhs IM for about 4 weeks. Following, we could see the complete resolution of the inflammation with the visual acuities improving to 6/9, and the restoration of outer retinal layers is happening in both eyes. So this is one of the things where early diagnosis and appropriate treatment in infective uveitis can result in better outcome. The next case is a case of a 21-year female presented with decreased vision of 3 days duration. She gave history of fever, visual acuity of 624. We could see the hyperemia of the disc with multiple retinal hemorrhages with focal areas of retinitis in the posterior pole. FFA shows early hypo with late hypofluorescence with multiple hypofluorescent spots corresponding to the areas of the retinal hemorrhages with tortuous vessels. OCT shows altered foveal contour with focal areas of hyperreflectivity underneath the fovea. This particular pattern is suggestive of foveolitis. Based on this morphology, we did suspect dengue in this case. On investigations, the dengue IgG antibodies was positive along with serum increased homocysteine level was increased with vitamin B12 deficiency. So patient was put on systemic steroids along with corrective measures and folic acid supplements for hyperhomocysteinemia, following which we could see the resolving macular edema in this case. Yes, multimodal imaging helps us to pinpoint the probable differential diagnosis to investigate according to the findings. Here is a 46-year female presented with blurred vision in both eyes. We can see mutton fat keratic precipitates on anterior segment examination in both eyes. And also you could see the hyporeflective multiple choroidal granulomas in both eyes. Clinically, she's diagnosed to have bilateral granulomatous panuveitis. FFA shows diffuse dilatation of the vessels with disc leak with leakage from the vessels, suggestive of a perivascular leak. She's diagnosed on investigations found to have a sarcoidosis. OCT shows well-defined hyporeflective choroidal granuloma in both eyes. Following treatment with systemic steroids, you could see the complete resolution and disappearance of the keratic precipitates both on anterior segment photography and confocal microscopy. The OCT shows healed granuloma in this eye, and here other eye showing healing granuloma. So here again, the imaging helps us not only for the diagnosis, but also monitoring the response to treatment in these cases. A 56 years male presented with recurrent uveitis and not responding well to the systemic steroids. He had few white keratic precipitates. Confocal imaging showed incomplete floral pattern on both eyes. Fundus imaging showed vitritis with multiple ill-defined hypopigmented lesions in the fundus. FFA shows block fluorescence with multiple hyperfluorescent spots in both eyes. I would like to draw attention to OCT, which shows multiple vertical hyperreflective lines. This is one of the earliest biomarker for intraocular lymphoma. In addition to that, you could see the sub-RP deposits. This is again is a classical biomarker, what we see it in case of intraocular lymphoma. The first biopsy, vitreous biopsy, was negative, and subsequently the lesions started increasing, and the repeat biopsy is confirmed to be a intraocular lymphoma. Autofluorescence shows early hypo with hyperautofluorescent lesions in the left eye, and during the follow-up, we could see the increasing in the sub-RP deposits, and subsequently the patient started on intravitreal and systemic chemotherapy.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am. Would appreciate if you end in next 30 seconds.
Sure, thank you. So here is a case of a leukemia which shows Confocal shows hyperchromatic nuclei with enlarged cells corresponding to the blast cells. Here is a case of idiopathic retinal vasculitis. Fundus photograph is normal, staining and leakage on FFA, where you can see the perivascular cuffing of adaptive optics. Following treatment, you could monitor the response to treatment with the disappearance of the cuffing in this case. To conclude, multimodal imaging can help not only in making the diagnosis or confirming the diagnosis, and also it's documenting and following up of patients with various uveitic conditions affecting the anterior and posterior segment of the eye. However, when there is an RPE and chorial capillaries are affected, autofluorescence is the preferred mode of monitoring the disease. Vasculitis, we monitor with the fundus fluorescein angiography. In case of inflammatory CNVM, we use OCTA to monitor the response to treatment. With this few words, I thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, ma'am. They're great cases, and we enjoyed all of them very much. And with this, we'd like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Anamika Patel, who has a very important talk on indications of vitreous and aqueous biopsy. Over to you, Dr. Anamika.
Thanks, Dr. Anirudh. My slides are visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
All right. Okay. So I'm sure all of us have somewhere in our life reached this time where we were at the crossroads. For me, it was when I got this topic, when I had to think of what I'm gonna say when I have to speak on the indications of aqueous and the vitreous biopsy. So before I begin that, let me express my gratitude to Dr. SS and AIOS for giving me the opportunity to speak. And let me now address the elephant in this room. So let me do that with the help of the 4 questions. First is, when should I tap? Second is, which one to tap? And the last would be, which investigation you should be asking when you are tapping. So the first question is, when should I tap? And the answer is that there are 3 indications that you can think of when you want to tap the patient. First would be when you are seeing a typical presentation. Second would be when you are seeing an atypical presentation. And third would be when you see an inadequate response to the treatment. Now, let me tell you that typical presentation means when it follows a pattern. So in that, if you want to confirm the diagnosis, that's the time then when you would like to tap your patient. Atypical presentation is when it is not following the pattern, and inadequate response to treatment, I'll be showing you. So pattern recognition means when, with the help of the certain clinical features and your clinical acumen, when it kind of matches a certain pattern, it helps you in deriving to a clinical diagnosis. So for example, in this case here, we can see in this fundus photograph, there are these necrotizing retinitis with multiple hemorrhages. We can see hard exit, we see the optic disc is obscured. So with this Pizza-by appearance, it's like a no-brainer. You will think that's a CMV retinitis. Of course, it's CMV retinitis. So that was pattern recognition. When you look into this fundus photograph and you see this unifocal necrotizing retinitis at posterior pole, you see the presence of this beautiful chirales all along. So here the diagnosis of toxoplasmosis is right in the hand. And third would be when you see this ground glass-like appearance and the presence of these multiple miliary lesions. So based on this, you'll think of the syphilitic chorioretinitis. So based on certain clinical features, and when it kind of matches a pattern and you come to a diagnosis, that is typical presentation when you are able to identify the pattern recognition. But suppose you see a case like this. For example, here, this is like a clover leaf kind of a pattern, and there is a presence of a retinitis here. So you don't know what you're dealing with. Similarly, in this case here, you are seeing that below the vessel, there is yellowish necrotizing kind of a lesion here. And there is a presence of this central clearing here. So again, these would be the cases where you would want to tap because you would want to know that what you're dealing with. Now, let me address the third indication for when do you want to tap would be when you see an inadequate response to the therapy. So for example, this gentleman who presented with this fibrinous anterior uveitis who was treated with the topical steroids, when on 3rd day, he developed this large fibrin here, which is kind of obscuring the pupillary axis. And you can see the presence of a hypopyon. So here the diagnosis was revised to the endogenous endophthalmitis. Now this was the time then you would want to tap your patient. So I have told you that the 3 indications where you would want to tap. Now let me take you through the second question, which is which one to tap. You have two options, aqueous or vitreous. So logical thinking would be that you would tap the area where the site of the infective foci is max, so that you'll get a better yield. So let's take this question that when you should be tapping the aqueous. So now take a look at this photograph. This is a case of an anterior uveitis patient who had this pigmented keratic precipitates. Now just let's reflect on this pearl for a moment, that when you see the pigmented keratic precipitates in an anterior uveitis, most likely you are dealing with a viral etiology. So here it could be either HSV or VZV or CMV. So here, if you're wondering that which viral virus it is, you would want to tap, and then you would tap the aqueous. And again, one more important point here, that provided the vitreous is absolutely clear and there is no lesion in the retina. That means when you are sure that you're dealing with only with the anterior segment presentation, which is anterior uveitis with pigmented KP. Now you all must be remembering, I took this example where this patient who was presented with fibrinous anterior uveitis developed endogenous endophthalmitis because we could see the hypopyon and this fibrin and stuff. So here this patient also had vitritis, and the B-scan showed the presence of this lot of membranous echoes. So that's the point where we thought and we would think of going to the vitreous for the root. Now again, so when you see the keratic precipitates in a setting of an anterior uveitis, so the aqueous PCR is the way to go, which has a sensitivity and a specificity of 72.7% and 78.3%. Now, we know the indications. Now we know which are the conditions when you want to tap the aqueous. Now let's take a look when you want to tap the vitreous. So this is a case of a 38-year-old gentleman who was a diabetic patient and was recently COVID recovered. And he presented to us with the complaints of diminution of vision, which was counting finger close to face. And here you can see this yellowish retinitis lesion, chorioretinitis lesion here. You can see the presence of this telangiectasia. There's a lot of fluid around, and you can see the slight dilatation at the superiotemporal arcade. And if you do the corresponding OCT, you can see that though the retinitis is there, it's kind of popping up out in the vitreous, which is kind of a rain cloud-like sign. And at this point in time, this OCT would tell you that if you do the posterior vitreous biopsy right at this site, the yield would be better for you. So this is a case where you would want to do the vitreous biopsy. Now let me take you through another example. Now here you are seeing this large retinitis lesion, which is going right up, and you see this disc is involved and you don't know what it is. I mean, this was a case of an ocular toxoplasmosis, but the caveat here is that in atypical presentation of toxoplasmosis, immune status of the patient is of paramount importance, because though we know that Goldman-Whitwer coefficient is the gold standard, but it is sensitive only in the immunocompetent patient. The reason why we keep seeing the various kind of the PCR profile is because not one DNA is analyzed. So that's the reason why in immunocompromised patient, the PCR yield through vitreous is better. Again, this is a case of a choroidal metastasis patient where the transvitreal biopsy was done. The indication is just that it gives you a better yield of about 85 to 97%. Coming to the last case, which is of an intraocular lymphoma, here you would want to do the vitreous biopsy because you want to look at the interleukin 10 and 11, and you look at the vitreous specimens. Now, the one important point here is that you would want to do this culture and PCR for a diluted specimen, and for undiluted, you want to do the cytology and immunohistochemistry. Again, another very important point that if the CSF biopsy confirms the lymphoma, you need not do the vitreous biopsy. So now you know the indications. Now you know which one you want to tap. Now let's come to the investigation you should ask for. So based on your relevant clinical history, based on your sharp clinical acumen and your first to differentiate, in an endophthalmitis patient, you would want vitreous. For pigmented KPs, you would want to do the PCR. For lymphoma, you want to do immunohistochemistry.
Sorry to interrupt, ma'am.
And I
Sorry
lead
to
to with this
interrupt.
question that what if the lab's result give you a different analysis in terms of your differential diagnosis and gives you a negative result? Thank you. And I would like to invite you to this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Anamika, for a very nice talk on indications for vitreous and aqueous biopsy with excellent illustrative photographs. Yeah, we really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. Next, I invite the next presenter, Dr. Dipankar Das, who's a uveitis specialist and ocular pathologist at Shankar Dev Netralaya from Guwahati. Dr. Dipankar Das has done extensive work on parasitic uveitis. So with these few words, I invite Dr. Dipankar Das to speak on biopsy pathology in uveitis with case examples. Over to Dr. Dipankar.
Thank you, Dr. Padma. Are my slides visible?
You need to
Not yet, sir.
Not visible?
No, sir, not yet. If I could guide you, sir, there is a small button, share screen. But
Yeah.
before that, you need to open the
Yeah, now
PPT.
visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
But you just have to on the slide share. Yeah. Thank you.
Now it's visible, no?
Yes, sir, on the first slide now.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Padma. Thank you, Dr. Somashila. Such a brilliant meeting she has arranged. And thank you, AIOS, for giving me this opportunity. Now, I do not have any financial interest in this presentation. Now, this is basically a clinical pathological cases. All of you have seen my previous speaker has shown a lot of slides, histopathological slides, biopsy pathology examples. These are so wonderful. Just to see this case. Now, this may be a repetition of earlier case where you can see that white eye, but there's a convex hypopyon with a white pupillary. Now, immediately the masquerades come into mind, and obviously this is a retinoblastoma case where retinoblastoma is seen in T1-weighted images in MRI. Now, in this situation, you can do a paracentesis and hyperchromatic nuclei with this retinoblastoma cell can be seen. Then immediately the enucleation and other protocol for the retinoblastoma can be done in these patients. Now, in our two publications, we have seen such unsuspected retinoblastoma in few cases in our Northeast Indian population. The second case is very, very interesting. A 23-year female presented with redness, pain, photophobia for 1 month. There was no history of trauma in the right eye. There was history of Tricot injection posterior subtenon given in 2015. The vision was in the right eye, counting finger 1 meter. MRI done at Shillong, Meghalaya showed a ciliary body melanoma. In this clinical picture, you can see hypopyon, and there was also a sclerosis. Now, B-scan ultrasound and UVM showed a ciliary body mass, and in T1-weighted images and T2-weighted images in axial and sagittal section of MRI, you can see a ciliary body lesion here. Now, for differential diagnosis, melanoma was thought, retinoblastoma, medulloepithelioma, hematogenous malignancy, and infectious endophthalmitis was thought in these cases. Infectious panel were normal. Peripheral blood showed some sort of anemic changes in these cases. Enucleation was planned in these cases, and the enucleation I both showed exudaretinal detachment here, and with the lesion there and increase in the ciliary body region here. Now, these cases has a scleritis as well as ciliary body involvement. You can see in the high power objective of microscope, you can see there are large plasma cells. Okay, so initially we thought whether we are dealing with plasmacytoma. Serum electrophoresis showed some fraction involvement, but here this is polymorphic. This is both CD20 20 and CD3 were positive in this case. So it is not a tumor, but something else. CD138 for plasma cell was positive, and HMB45 was negative, ruling out melanoma in this case. Now, IgG4 was done out of the plasma cell, which was around 35% of the cases, Garcia SRL red vaccine. Now, bone marrow examination showed anemic changes. The treatment was given, and we published this case in 2015 as IgG4-related intraocular inflammation, muscular edema, ciliary body melanoma. But story does not end here. 2015, patient presented with severe inflammation in the left eye. Then patient was initially treated with oral steroid in Guwahati. Then patient wanted to take a second opinion. I asked them to visit my mentor, Professor Jyotirmoy Biswas at Chennai. Now, these are the Chennai documentation where they have seen increased retinochoroidal elevation. There's a fluid in the subtenon spaces, and this is the patient in this 2001. You can see there was a scleritis, there was a some sort of hypopyon as well as, and vision dropped down very drastically. Professor Biswas was telling me so much aggressive lesion, and she dealing with such a patient, he was very caring about the patient. Now we see this was TAP was done again from the left eye, and it showed mixed inflammatory pathology. Patient was started on Predford as well as continuation of oral steroid along with atropine. Whole body PET scan was done, Professor Biswas in academic way, and this patient was running short of money in Chennai, and the result was that it was normal. Now this is whether IgG4 disease has had such an aggressive outcome. We are not sure. We are not know the outcome of the disease, but now the patient is on follow-up. The third case is a 28-year-old man with dimness of vision in the right eye for 5 months. Previously, he was diagnosed to have ulcerative colitis with GIT polyp. Anterior chamber was quiet. Vitreous cells were large in the left eye with haze +2 present. Ocular imaging showed diffuse choroidal mass in the right eye, and the paracentesis was the vitreous step was done by vitreoretinal surgeon. It showed atypical cells. In follow-up, again, ultrasound was done, and it showed a laterally spreading tumor, and it was enucleated. You can see a lot of heterogeneous tissue with the pigmented tumor, and this with retinal detachment in this case. We have done in gross examination, the melanocytic cells were perivenular, pericentric involvement along the veins was noted. There's a gross involvement was seen in this case. Now we see there's a melanocytic proliferation was seen in these cases. Interestingly, if you see, there was a sparing of the choriocapillaries, which was very interesting. HMB45, also you can see the sparing of choriocapillaries. Now, this was a nuclear eyeball revealed evidence of diffuse uveal melanocytic proliferation, but he presented with a dimness of vision in the left eye. So what happened? There was a fundus was normal. We have done ERG. ERG showed a scotopic response diminished in this case. This is the post-operative patient with a prosthesis in the right eye, and this patient was having a pigmented lesion in the glans penis and is on follow-up. So this is a very interesting case which we have seen and published in a Professor Nema's textbook. Now see clinical pathological correlation and immunohistochemistry of Box-Harada's disease. Probably this was the first report from India where VKH pathology was seen in a 40-year-old person, where diffuse stromal choroiditis was seen with a photoreceptor degeneration and RP undulation. What you see in the OCT, the multi-pocket fluid accumulation in the outer retinal layer, this was seen in these cases with in histopathology. The T cell were much more than the B cell in these cases. Sympathetic ophthalmia also we have seen few number of cases. This is one of the cases, again 24-year female which had a chicken pox history, and we have reported the infectious cause probably inciting a bilateral sympathetic ophthalmia. Now, this has a stromal choroiditis with a sparing of choriocapillaries. CD3 was positive than CD20 cases. Recently we have one paper is accepted, but we have found CD20 is positive rather than CD3 because of the change of immunogenicity. Histopathology and molecular pathology diagnosis for acute retinal necrosis. This is again Shankardev Netralaya. Professor Biswas sent me the enucleated eyeball to me for the histopathology. And this patient had a PCR for nested PCR for varicella zoster as well as real-time PCR done, and we have documented in our lab the in fluorescent stain the multinucleated giant cell, and in histopathology the giant cell of varicella zoster infection. Parasitic disease, as Padma told, is a heart in my heart. Now this is a rare case of anterior chamber diaphoresis. You can well appreciate it. And we have seen the patient live and followed by scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive spectroscopy. What
Sorry to interrupt, sir.
Yeah.
If you could end in the next 30 seconds.
2 seconds.
Thank you.
Yeah. Professor Ratinam et al. Has shown that various clinical examination and investigative procedure helpful for ocular inflammation. We have put live examination of parasite is very, very important. To take home message, biopsy pathology in uveitis is very important. ACTEP for cytology, vitreous test, tissue biopsy, chorioretinal biopsy, etc. can be diagnostic. Molecular pathology, particularly for immunohistochemistry, molecular microbiology, particularly PCR, as I've shown you, aid in the diagnosis. Scanning electron microscope with EDX can be helpful in parasitic uveitis. Thank you for patience. I like to acknowledge Professor Biswas and Professor Islam and SSN Lab. Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me extra time.
Thank you, Dr. Deepankar, for the enlightening talk on clinico-pathological correlation, whatever we are seeing clinically, and you showed us with the histopathology to understand the disease much better. Thank you so much. Now,
can I ask questions to Deepankar?
Yes.
Thank you, Deepankar. That was a brilliant talk. I have a couple of practical questions to you. Like if we have a patient where I'm not sure of the diagnosis, one-eyed patient, and the opposite eye I want to, enucleate, which is a blind eye, but the patient by and large, they do not say yes right at the beginning. So you do start steroids for the eye, which you can save, and you want to remove the eye from opposite eye for making the diagnosis. What's initiating the steroids and doing enucleation, say 5-7 days later, make a difference in the histological presentation of the disease?
Yeah, that's very important question to understand the pathogenesis of sympathetic ophthalmia. If
Not
you see sympathetic ophthalmia,
it could be anything.
Yeah,
It could be
anything. But mostly the prototype of a pen uveitis is a sympathetic ophthalmia. Now, if you see the age of
1 second, if I had a sympathetic ophthalmia, I will not want to enucleate the opposite eye. I'm talking of the diagnostic dilemma here. It's not a straightforward sympathetic to me. I don't know what it is. And I know eventually the patient, we will not be able to get much from the investigations. Or the investigation that patient is carrying with him is not leading us anywhere. So can I still give him IV methylpred and do enucleation of the opposite eye after say 5-7 days?
Yeah, thing is that first of all, we have seen a bilateral, for example, in the morning class today, I presented a number of cases of rubella eye disease. Now these diseases are mostly a bilateral affection. Now you see one cases, around 6 years old boy had a bilateral uveitis, and the ELISA showed IgG4 for the rubella. Now this is the case where even the surgeon or the clinician want a diagnosis of the case. Now they have chosen a eye which is worst eye, and they have enucleated the eye, and the enucleated eye showed all the changes in the lens, changes in the retinal pigment epithelium, consistent with rubella. Now it helped in the diagnosis, because if you see, even the simple length changes in the rubella is so important, because those length changes, retained nuclei in the lens, can be a pathognomonic for the disease itself. So this gives a clue that you are confirming your diagnosis. Secondly, the most important thing is that molecular biology, if you want to prove that or save the eye, for example, if you, but no. thing is that we take a oats tie to be enucleated.
No, that I totally understand. I'm not asking you the importance. I'm just asking that if I'm planning to do the enucleation for diagnostic purposes, but patient is delaying it for whatever reason, can we start steroids in the meantime? For the
steroid may not be answer for something. Suppose it is a disease causing by viral infection. So in this situation, suppose it is a case of any virus, varicella zoster, that's all. Then steroid starting will be very, very detrimental for the patient. It can lead.
I'm not talking about the patient. Is steroid starting some way affect the histopathologic results?
Histopathology results affects, because if you see, yeah, okay. one thing is that I've told you two examples of sympathetic ophthalmia. One is that most of the sympathetic ophthalmia are T-cell disease, CD3 positive. CD20 is less positive. But in some occasion, after 3 or 4 weeks of systemic steroid, the disease one goes to the chronicity, then the plasma cell take up, and there may be B-cell proliferation of the disease. So steroid may affect, immunosuppressive may affect in the immunogenicity of the disease condition.
And there is a question from Dr. Gupta that what would be the special technique for choroidal biopsy? And for me, that once you have done the biopsy with that special technique, what will be the special way you will take that sample to the pathologist?
Yeah, for example, if it is a choroidal biopsy, if the vitreoretinal surgeon is there purview to give. I am not a vitreoretinal surgeon, so by procedure, whether they are taking a retinochoroidal biopsy, that or previously they have taken a vitreous biopsy or a vitreous step. For example, lymphoma cases, lymphoma which are not diagnosed by a say vitreous step, so you require a chorioretinal biopsy. And these steps, when they send in, the thing is that few cases, for example, if it's a retina tissue, it is very, very friable. Now, getting a inclusion body in that active retinal tissue is a challenge. For example, if it is a active retinitis, where suppose it is a acute retinal necrosis caused by either a varicella zoster, CMV, or a herpes simplex virus. Now, their tissue is very, very friable. Transfer of the tissue from the OT to the lab should be very fast, like lymphoma cells. Okay, it should be very fast. The media, media. For example, the media, because what I do, for example, in the enucleated eyeball, I see the retinal pigment epithelium taking a small chip out of it. I see so much pathology in retinal pigment epithelium, because these are, if even the direct tissue from the OT can help me in diagnosing the retinal pigment epithelium if you dissect it out. This gives me wide range of inflammation. Even doing some spatial stain that we have innovated, a fluorescent direct staining can show you inclusion bodies there. It can show even a fungus there. Fungus can be picked up. I have picked up fungus number of cases by doing just a drop of fluorescein over the tissue, whether it's a corneal tissue.
Ankur, sorry for interrupting you. My question was very, very pointed, because I wanted to know if there is any talent exists in this country for doing choroidal biopsies. Retinal biopsies we have been doing for years. We have been doing all that, which is retinal biopsy. Retinal biopsy is not a challenge. My question is very specific to obtaining a choroidal biopsy using either internal technique or using a trapdoor technique from the external surface, from the scleral side. So if you have, as a pathologist, you would know if anybody in the country is, doing that choroidal biopsy, because many a time you have those patients, you do whatever you can do, they don't respond. At that point of time, you want to have a histopathological diagnosis or help from the pathologist.
Yeah,
that is what this actual question is. So
yeah,
if you are aware of.
Yeah, I have a very limited access to the direct choroidal biopsy. Thing is that I have seen a biopsy of a cystic sulcus lesion where from the scleral side they have moved inside the eye. Cystic sulcus lesion. Whereas they have taken.
That's okay. Dipankar, I did that 40 years ago. That's not the question. The question is specific to choroid. I think Vishali understands the question very well. I want to know if anyone in the country who are attending this.
No, I don't think you can ask Professor Bishwas direct choroidal biopsy, but in tumor cases,
not in tumor.
One case I remember of Dr. Lingam Gopal sir removing a retinoblastoma tumor by making a sclerotomy wound. Okay, in this situation, the choroid tissue can come, but directly choroidal tissue biopsy, I haven't got the sample.
So Padma, would you like to moderate few more questions, Anirudh?
Sure, ma'am. I request all the chairperson and speakers to unmute themselves, and you can come on for the panel discussion. Yeah, we'll start with Dr. Biswas.
I think Dr. Biswas had to go to other session. He's not around.
Sure, ma'am. So, Dr. Mamta, what are the conditions do you prefer to do a dual angiography? The combination of FFA and ICG simultaneously for the of the audience.
All the lesions which involve the choroid, as we see that we know more in ICG than what we know in FFA. So I actually routinely do in both anything which is panuveitis, choroidal lesions like choroiditis or panuveitis where we have VKH or sympathetic. So I guess those are the conditions, or something like white dot syndromes where we are really not seeing enough to clinch a diagnosis. So I think most of the patients with posterior uveitis, we go for both.
So Mamta, has your practice changed during COVID times?
Practice?
ICG, ordering and all.
Moderating means I'm not really changing on immunosuppression therapy.
No, ICG.
ICG, not really.
Okay.
We haven't come across any major changes. But we are seeing quite a few cases now, post-vaccination uveitis I'm seeing.
I just sent a mail.
Yeah, I saw that.
You should enter.
Yeah, I will do that.
Thank you. Now there is a question which has come from the chat box to Dr. Salil. Should we stop chest X-ray and advise HRCT bar PET scan based on the patient's affordability, of course, in a suspicious situation now, not all cases?
I have stopped doing chest X-rays completely. So if there are issues of affordability or inaccessibility of either HRCT or PET scan, I prefer not to do anything at all and treat the patient on clinical suspicion only. Doing chest X-rays actually I found gives you a very misleading false negative on most occasions. So there is no point doing chest X-ray at all. Chest X-ray is only good for pre-employment screening. That's all, nothing else.
So just to interrupt here, Salil, I wanted to know, even for the first time patient when we see, are we justified in just doing a PET scan than an X-ray?
As a general policy, if it's that garden variety of anterior uveitis, not posterior, garden variety of anterior uveitis, non-granulomatous, very mild, responds extremely well to just a few days of prednisolone drops, and MANTU is negative, which is very clearly negative, means 1 millimeter, 2 millimeter, I usually don't do anything there. Then I just wait and watch and see if there is a recurrence in the future.
But then Mantle negative can be a sign for sarcoid also, right? So how do we
Exactly.
just sarcoid, Mantle negative?
Mantle sarcoid patients usually never have only 1, 2, 3 millimeters. They have clear energy. So if you have clear energy, it's a very good sign that you should do an HRCT. If you have obviously positive reaction, it's a very clear sign that you should do HRCT. My experience, maybe others may have a different perspective, but whatever patients of sarcoid I have seen, they all have a long standing persistent cough.
So Salil, can we put it this way, that for patients for whom affordability is an issue, get an X-ray chest done. If you find some lymph nodes, hilar lymph nodes, you are good. If you get a normal, it doesn't mean anything.
Doesn't mean anything at all.
But if it is positive, maybe it's good then not doing it at all. Like we don't do it now anymore. But if there are real issues with affordability and if one wants to try, but negative doesn't mean anything.
Negative doesn't mean anything at all.
Salil, can I ask you if you ever subject your patients who have lymphnopathy to a biopsy?
Yes, I manage these patients along with a pulmonologist. And once I send this patient with the PET CT or the HRCT reports to him, if he has some clinical doubts still, then we invariably get a mediastinoscopy done, or we do an EBUS, or we do a TBNA, if any of these nodes are very accessible. But we don't want to open up the chest per se to get the nodes. If any of them are accessible.
In your experience, what percentage of patients would have, say, a subcentimetric lymph nodes?
No, we don't do. I don't evaluate patients with subcentimetric lymph nodes at all.
Not evaluate at all.
Not at all. I don't even consider it significant, nor do I advise biopsy, nor do I treat it.
They won't do biopsy. And there is a question from Kalpana that you are still doing HRCT for all your patients in COVID times?
Absolutely.
Okay.
What has happened in Bombay is that some CT centers have become designated as COVID centers to do only COVID patients.
Okay.
And some have become designated as non-COVID centers where you can do everybody else.
Okay.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Amita.
I think if it's a granulomatous anterior uveitis, I would want to investigate. If it's a non-granulomatous uveitis and a young patient with other symptoms of spondyloarthropathy, probably I would like to do an HLA-B27 as well, because those are the patients where you would like to initiate them on treatment much earlier, not only ophthalmology treatment, but also refer them to a rheumatologist so that they can be evaluated systemically and they can be put on DMARDs.
The next question is for Dr. Pato. How often is syphilis a cause of scleritis? You can take up this question.
Yeah, syphilis is a great masquerader. You have suspected in all cases of uveitis and syphilis, scleritis. So if there is any slightest doubt, one should go ahead with the syphilis testing.
I'm sorry, but we are out of time. We'll appreciate if we could sum it up in the next 30 seconds. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for giving us a very insightful listing on imaging as well as investigation. I think we did not have time to discuss about the imaging, but my personal call these days is how to develop algorithms for doing tailored imaging. Because for investigations, we have been harping on tailored investigation all our lives. But for imaging in the era of multimodal imaging, we are kind of confused, doing everything for everybody, which may not be a great approach. But it has been a very interesting session, and it's lovely to see all our friends, though virtually. So hopefully, by next year, we would be able to meet in person. Thank you very much. And I would like to pass it on to the next chair's Professor Gupta.
Thank you.
Thank you.